Our first session is on topic, Making the Vernacular Contemporary by our esteemed speaker, Architect Dean D. Cruz. May I now invite Architect Dean D. Cruz for his presentation, but before that, few words about him. Architect Dean D. Cruz is a graduate in architecture and is actively involved in professional practice as well as in academics. He has conducted numerous workshops and seminars on architecture, planning, and the environment across India as well as abroad. His works and articles have been published in leading magazines in India and abroad, supported the Royal Institute of Art, Stockholm, Oxford Brookes University, UK, and Pratt Institute, New York for their architectural and planning programs in Goa. He is a partner and principal architect in MOZAIC Design Combine, a leading design firm based in Goa, involved in urban intervention, architecture, conservation, product, and graphic design. Architect Dean has also been a recipient of numerous awards, which includes Designer of one of the 100 best small hotels in the world, Designer of the Year Special Commendation, Excellence in Interior Design Award Commercial category are few of them. He is also a member of the state level committee to prepare the regional plan for Goa 2021. Twice president of Candidate of Saligao, working on development issues in the village. Architect Dean is also a member of Board of Studies of Architecture and Design colleges like Avani Institute of Design, BBB College of Engineering and Technology, and many more. We welcome you on board, sir.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. So today I'm going to speak on making the vernacular contemporary. While we have, I'm working in a place which has a great history, a great architectural history and cultural and both a built and a natural heritage, because we're part of the Western Ghat, which is extremely sensitive. So over centuries, of course, this architecture has morphed through the various things. There were various civilizations that moved through here. The Mughals were here, the Kadamba Empire was here, the Portuguese were here. And of course, now you have the new political.
Yeah, I think there is some network issue.
Goa, which also keeps on.
So your voice is lagging. There's some internet lag.
There's an internet lag?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned a little earlier, we come from an area which has a great amount of cultural diversity over the centuries. And it's also led to an architecture which has very different styles that have emerged over the years. So even though we started our work in Goa, we work across the country now in various climatic regions, various cultural regions. And it's given us a great insight into the way architecture is influenced by its location, by the people that are around, the crafts that are available, the materials that are available. So I'll share with you today our projects, which basically are influenced by that. Share screen. And this one. Can you see it?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, so I go to the slideshow. Yeah, so that's of course in the cover slide. That's one of our projects in Madhya Pradesh, which is a very jungle, rural sort of thing, but yet there are people living over there, and the architecture is greatly influenced, of course, by the materials and the limitations, being very remote, of course, the limitations of materials that are available. We started off as architects. My partner at that time, Jared, worked with Laurie Baker, and Laurie Baker has a unique style. Of course, he worked mainly in Kerala, and he looked at the materials around him. I mean, he looked at, say, the brickwork around that is available in Kerala, which is good quality. There was also a fair amount of woodwork, but he recognized that too much of woodwork would also mean cutting down, more trees in the area. So he worked mainly with brickwork, and he also developed this things like the rat trap barn, the jali walls, contemporized whatever existing that he could see from a traditional architecture, and he sort of innovated with even the concrete over there, creating the filler slab that is well known, where you have these little hollows in the non-structural areas of the slab, which not only brought the cost down by reducing the amount of concrete, but also created an insulation layer on it. And so even though Keller had, say tile roofs, whenever he'd hardly use a tile roof, he'd use, broken chips. There was a great amount of recycling of material that took place in Baker's architecture. So you could see that even though he was drawing from a vernacular, he was able to completely innovate in what he was doing. So in our office, which we first built, we were greatly influenced by Baker's thing. So the jali work and the sort of bonding that he had, as you can see, is represented over here. Our roofing system, of course, we just used at that time was RMP, which is red mud plastic, which is basically PVC mixed with the bauxite, from waste materials, and that's been lasting now for almost 30 years. It was like a PVC sheet. It should have degraded completely by now, but the alumina actually stabilizes it. So of course, this is an old building which we gutted completely. We created this jali wall and wraparound thing, and letting this very filtered light into the space. We called ourselves natural architecture because we felt that we were working in a natural and maybe a very sensible way of working. So there wasn't a style about architecture. So of course, like Baker, we use a lot of waste material. We recycle stuff. So the gate, for example, is all recycled, steel from construction sites, car parts, old grinding stones, as corbels. So there's a great amount of detail, and we worked in a way in which we actually designed and built. So we're both architects and contractors. We designed and built over 50 buildings on our own. And of course, using masons, and a lot of the masons we trained over the years. In fact, over the years we've trained about 200 masons to work in a traditional vernacular style of architecture. So that's of course our reception area, and so every building was very different. It responded to the site, it responded to the materials that are available, but each one was innovative. So for example, in this building, the windows, we thought, how do we reduce, say, the materials used in the windows? So here we did a ferro cement window, but you can see the traditional elements of coming out of the shutter, the ventilator, the awning, but it's done in a completely new material. So even the grill is actually part of that whole ferro cement thing. So you just create the frame with a mesh around it, and you plaster on it. So you've used a traditional sort of form, but you've used almost new material. And the only alien element, of course, is that wooden shutter, which is there. So minimizing, again, the use of wood, and yet incorporating all the micro elements of what a window needs to have in terms of grill, sill, awning, ventilator, shutter, etc. So recycling materials was another aspect of, how do you make something more genuine? And that is by using a lot of the old building materials. So here, of course, we bought old columns from old houses, old tiles from old houses. We use them traditional way. We also use those tiles to create corbels, which is a traditional sort of form of architecture which protects the walls from rain. So of course we went even more than what traditional houses have. While most have about 3 or 4 lines of corbels, we went up to about 8 lines of corbels to make sure that these corbels protected the walls as much as possible. And as I said, each building is completely unique and different, but incorporating a lot of the recycled elements in it. So here, of course, is the central core of the house, where it's staircase going up, and you can see, arches, walls, domes, and all these are people who did not have an idea of building in such brickwork. They were trained over the years, and they slowly adopted this sort of style of architecture, and now our own. So masons have started their own. They become contractors, and they're doing their own stuff on their own. So every house, I said, was unique. It responded to unique thing. You can see the Baker influence, the filler slab, the twisted column, the way stonework that's there both on the walls and the flooring. So extremely low cost, and yet very expressive. So every house sort of had this great amount of detail in it, because you're able to afford it. There are hardly any drawings made. It's all intuitive. So we just make these bare sketches, and we leave it to the masons to actually take over. And that's what traditional architecture has done. But there are very few architects in the old days, were just master masons or master craftspeople. And they would take the architecture to a level of great detail. They'd add that flavor to it, they'd add that level of detail. So it's how you as an architect need to pull back and let these craftspeople, give them dignity and let them do what they like to. So every house had this great twist to it. But we are conscious also that, while we're innovating and creating new forms or reinterpreting new forms, it's essential to root it. So you can see how we rooted the staircase, the columns in a very traditional, forms, but yet not exactly, the vernacular. It's always had a new sort of dimension to it, a new sort of nuance to it. Here again, you can see recycled windows, flooring tiles, all over the place, and the old shell windows also recycled. So each house ensured that by being low cost, by being sensible, that was something which you could bring costs down. Therefore, you could make the spaces larger or save the client a lot of money, and that is greatly appreciated in all the projects that we did. So every house you see is completely unique. So this is a house actually we did fairly recently. We moved on further into much wealthier houses, but we were challenged again by doing a house which is meant to be in just 11 lakhs. So this is a house which is close to the airport here in Goa, and of course, so when we look at housing, this we didn't build ourselves. The owner of the house actually got into the act of I will get involved in the construction. So he actually bought all the materials himself, whatever he could buy, recycled stuff, new stuff, but at a very low cost, and just there on site every day to build. And it's just a single space house actually. We just slopes up a hillside, gentle hillside, and use materials like recycled stones that we could, recycled bricks that we get, coconut wood, which is actually very cheap and economical. The lady of the house actually got involved in the decoration of it. And that's what traditional architecture does. There's a great amount of ornation that takes place in the architecture done by the owners themselves. So by doing this, we're actually recalling traditional systems of construction. That's the inside spaced house. And even the boys of the house got their act together. So they recycled their old scooter handle became a tap. The door, they used their old CDs, became like a shell window. That you can see the mirror detail. The skateboard became a shelf. All that was participative action, in the building of the house, which used to happen in the old days, almost like in a traditional village house, for example. Everybody else would contribute, either in the construction, offering some sort of detail of it. If you're a wood person, you're a steel person, if you're a brick person or plaster, you tap into these various resources that are there. Who's your neighbor? And you also help out when he's building his house. So that's what, really participative architecture and traditional vernacular architecture is all about. So one great way to actually learn what is vernacular, how to build new in a vernacular, is actually work with old buildings, work in the conservation on projects which actually need extension, renovation. So this is a house, of course, where we stripped off the plaster, we added new wings to it. The central courtyard became a pool. Of course, it's more luxurious now and it has a house. But we were conscious of the form, the details that we have. So whatever we added had a traditional touch, even though we can do it completely contemporary as well. We made sure that it looked like it was always there. The staircase, for example, on the left is always there. All the doors, windows are actually brand new, but they are in an old style. In this particular house, we added, wings to it. It was just where the white wall was the actual end of the house. But we felt that house needed to come out and greet its visitors and even respond to the rooms. So the bedrooms, the living areas had those little porches that you see like on the right-hand side with inbuilt seats, because these houses were all about actually living the outside, living in the veranda. And usually the verandas has no furniture. It's just, a railing and you pull out the chair. So here we decided that we actually have to have built-in furniture. If it has to be used effectively, you could sit down, lie down on these things. And yet it looked like it was always been there. So how do you draw from a traditional architecture? How do you add new architectural elements like these porches and entrance pavilions, and yet make it feel like it's always been there? Is a challenge in working with the traditional and using details that actually reinforce the traditional. So here, for example, in this conservation project, we added the staircase. There's a tiny staircase going up. We felt we needed to celebrate the entrance, so we just added this wide, grand staircase to greet people, and yet it felt it was always there. The kitchen, for example, is actually brand new. The kitchen was not in an outhouse area, but we added these little arched platforms that made it look like it was, always been there for centuries. Little window seats are added to it, so it's the very thick walls, so you have enough space to actually carve these seats into the window. And it's a great place to sit and look out, which has been done traditionally as well. People used to sit next to windows and look out, especially if it was inclement weather. So in building, sometimes we work with traditional houses, and we also extend them. So this particular house, there was an existing house over there, and we needed to join it. So we linked it by this sort of courtyard entrance, where it's like a circular driveway. You come into this facade which actually screens the two houses. So rather than walking past a thin narrow site, rather than walking past one house and seeing it, we created this entrance corridor. So you can actually come down here and you come to the area, like a courtyard area between the two houses. So you can see a bit of the old house on the right hand side, and this corridor that you walk down from that entrance gate that you saw where the car was parked, and you move down into a central area, which actually is between the two houses, and there's a pool also between the two. So you've got the traditional house, which has in a very traditional style, and the far distance that you can see is a more contemporary house, but drawing elements of the house. So another conservation project where this became actually a shop and a little cafe area, where of course even the front wall is brand new, the porch is brand new, but we responded in the detailing in a way. So the old courtyard act, which is actually just a pit in the ground, became a space to sit out in the evening outside the cafe. And the cafe, this whole room was actually brand new, but we looked at the elements that we could draw, the doors, the windows, the roofing system. Actually, we designed a unique 7-planar truss system where you just had to bolt it together. There were no wood joints. We just lapped and with bolts that actually held together. So you can actually assemble it very easily on a step ladder rather than hoisting up a giant truss or making it over there. They were just small sections of straight piece of wood that you just pin together. And yet it had the appearance that it's always been there for centuries. So the floor is just plain IPS. So it also means working traditional is giving livelihoods to people, because here we got carpenters back in work, we got floor masons back in work, plasterers back in work, so all these were people that you're now giving livelihood to. Work is actually, pavilion. This privacy and security are not too much of a problem. So this is a house which is actually a series of pavilions, and most of our houses traditionally have been pavilions, have been very open to the outside. So whether it's courtyards or looking onto gardens, through verandas. So this house actually has these 3 pavilions. This is the entrance pavilion, which is basically the staff quarters and little car parking below the guest room. This is the living pavilion, and here you can see again the elements, traditional elements of the old Keller columns, recycling stuff, and also responding to what a sort of open, transparent architecture is. And you can see that even the living room actually, even though it's got windows and also, it can open up completely, and yet you can shut them with the shutters and seal it when you want to as well. And the last, of course, is the little bedroom pavilion. And this is also connected by this semi-open space, which traditional architecture had, which is really like hotel-like spaces or courtyard spaces. So this actually bridged the living and the bedroom pavilion, which is transparent and that the air sort of moved through. So most of our contemporary architecture actually shuts out the outside, whereas the traditional architecture responds to the green space in a very effective manner. So just simply opening out your architecture to nature is a step in the vernacular. So transparency has been a key word in the way we design our houses, especially where we want the air to flow through, especially in a hot and humid climate, is how do you get that air to flow through? This house, of course, is for a person from Kerala who lives in Goa. So we wanted that rooting of the building, even though it was a Kerala architecture, we imported into Goa, and we felt that climatically it actually worked very well, because traditional buildings in Goa, vernacular buildings in Goa, they're great looking buildings, white walls and windows. But Goa has a heavy monsoon like Kerala. And the overhangs that you see in traditional Goan houses are actually not very effective. So they have to put metal awnings outside the windows. The light levels in the house are very poor because the windows are small, or they have shell windows on them. The ventilation is very poor because the air just gets locked up. Even though the rooms are tall, the hot air just gets locked up. There's no way to actually let the hot air out. But a hot and humid climate needs that great amount of light and ventilation that enters the space. So this house, you can see that in this Keller style, we responded to an architecture which is very transparent, open, and we even got Keller carpenters to come and actually make. So you can see the details of the Keller roofing system, which has the little very thin rafters and tall rafters, but these little bracing elements, a little square wooden section that goes and prevents the rafter from actually warping under load. And the great amount of transparency from pavilion to pavilion that you can see, including in the bathroom area. So it's been a great influence of an architecture which you think is not from Goa. And is that valid is a question, because, you know, why didn't I really respond to a Goan architecture? My answer is simple, that because the Goan architecture does not offer the climatic sort of responses that is really needed. And it takes me back to Charles's famous lines, you know, form follows climate, you know, instead of form follows function, which is so true, because climate is a great influence of how we design our places, in response in terms of the overhang, the way we light it, the way we ventilate it, and the materials that are available because of the climatic region that we're sitting in. So again, you can see here a house which is a giant pavilion where the roof is just, you know, a giant umbrella, and there's a response to the light, the response to the hot air of the space, a response to even the lifestyle, because architecture is influenced by the lifestyle of it. Here, of course, it's a contemporary lifestyle. So even the kitchen is part of living spaces. And it's an Goan girl married to a German guy. So they wanted that great. So even there's no division even between the bedroom and the bathroom and everything. So it's only a couple living there. So it's one giant transparent space that they feel is their home. So it responds to changing lifestyles as well, that sort of needs the people. And a traditional architecture needs to do that. We have to do away with the typical typologies of living room, bedroom, toilet, kitchen. So can we create an architecture which is contemporary and yet pays respect to the traditional materials of craftsmanship or technologies that are available in the past in some way? So again, another house, again, where transparency, and you can see the little elements, like the little, what they call sopos, which are the balcons where people sit. When you enter the house, you can chat with the owner. So that's extremely essential that these are recalled in some way, because that roots the place, that actually gives a sense of rooting to the architecture, that, you know, okay, fine, this is a Goan house. It may look completely different from what a traditional Goan house is, but it's got these little elements which are essential, you know, to the space. And as I said earlier, it's all about the roof. You know, the roof is a protector. It really shades the walls from the heat, the rain, and also then determines how the architecture actually evolves. So on that previous slide, of course, was the semi-open space that linked the bedrooms and the living areas, and the interior detailing, again, in a very traditional roofing system. But you can see even the doors and windows, there's a certain level of contemporization in terms of the way we design the grills or little elements we put on the doors, instead of a folding mechanism, a sliding mechanism. So it's important to actually embrace new technologies and to actually say that, fine, this is more appropriate, you know, rather than a folding door, which would say hit that rocking chair. You know, a sliding door is far more appropriate, easier to actually handle. How can you use a trellis safe that screens up the kitchen? So all these are elements which you need to look at and be sensitive about and practical about. And it will still look old world, but you're actually being very direct about the solutions that you offer in the design. Another house where basically, again, how do you recall the past is say spaces like courtyards that you move inside. You can see in the left, peeping through is also a little water courtyard. And the roofing system is traditional. So we see also the ventilators above the door is a traditional Keller detail, where there's one fixed plank of wood and one open plank of wood. And all the open planks are actually connected by a rod. So in one, shifting just one panel, and all the panels open to 50% of the opening. The fixed ones remain where they are. And the sliding ones go in front of the fixed one. So you've got 50% opening of it, and that lets the hot air out. And the skylight as well, which actually lets in light at a higher level and also lets the hot air escape. So again, you're taking a traditional element, but you're adding a new flavor to it. You're adding new sort of dimension to the architecture, by simply being straight about that, I needed to be perform this sort of job, and therefore I will handle it in a particular way. So the form of roof may not be exactly, like a traditional thing. It may be like L-shaped or Z-shaped, whatever, as a total roof, because the planning requires that. But you're not constrained by that, because you're still responding in a practical way to what's needed to, say, light and ventilate the space below. Tradition is also about what you incorporate in. So this is a house close to Bombay for an art collector. So he wanted to incorporate his artwork into the building. So we need to respond in a way which got his artwork integrated into the buildings, whether he had old lamps or cupboards or and artifacts or say in the bathroom, but we'll all integrate into the architecture. But that immediately starts giving a routing of a tradition, of a vernacular into the architecture itself. Yeah. So all these old elements are incorporated into the architecture of the space. But vernacular is not just about the building itself. It's also about the outside spaces, the streets, the courtyards. So this is a housing project, again, where we created this long site, created a street where every unit is completely unique and different. And each unit actually looks onto the street. So there's also the thing of community interaction, because rather than have a thing of an isolated entrance, each house had a little porch of its own. You could sit in your balcony in the privacy of your own home, but enter and engage with the people across things. So you actually enter into this great gateway which frames the community entrance, and you can see that from one house to the other, you can actually look across the street and engage as a community with another person. And every house is unique, like traditional architecture. You don't have these cookie cutter thing of identical units that's taking place in the architecture today, especially done by developers, where they want to save money. They don't mind, everybody has an identical house. But here it was done such that everyone is actually unique. So whoever was there in the building process earlier said, I would like a staircase like this thing, I would like a courtyard like this, I'd like a bedroom overlooking this. So all these were incorporated into the design of this housing complex, such that each one felt that they almost had their perfectly individual house, and yet it's a row house. It's all interconnected, so they're not separate houses. One down this one long street, and everyone felt they were part of a community, of a village almost, that was there for many, many years. So this is the project which we mentioned earlier, which is rated at 1 of 100 best hotels at one time, which is built on top of the hill. And this was really also talking about tradition. Being on top of a hill, of course, far away from the sea, we had an issue of, people come to Goa because they want to be in the sea. So we said, let's create a giant pool to compensate for that. So this pool is at one end almost 3 meters deep. Before the regulations came out, 1.5 meter maximum. And we excavated the pool and got the rocks out and built the hotel with that. The reason for that, of course, was being on top of the hill was difficult to get these trucks, driving at heavy stones all the way up the hill. And it was a building, as you saw on the plan, a very free-form building. And we responded to that traditional of, arches and walls using the exposed stone, because Goa is all about the lateritic stone that's available over here. It's extremely cheap because you just get it from your site itself if you like. And so that was, and it also weathers beautifully, it being lateritic, and because a lot of ferrous content in it, it actually gets stronger being exposed to the elements. And so long as you protect it with no overhang, it doesn't even stain. If it's exposed completely, of course it stains, but it means just scrubbing it after the monsoons. And you see the detailing in it. It's very east meets west. You can see something slightly Moroccan in some places. You see something European in places. You see something Southeast Asian in places. It really draws from many cultures, and yet it holds together in some way. And that's an extremely important realization that we made, that you don't have to be locked into a particular style, into a particular cultural sort of influence of the architecture and the way they're using your doors, windows, roofing systems. So we borrow freely from architecture from all over the world, whatever and take whatever is appropriate to the way what we're designing. They can see, of course, free-form thing of just going wild. So it's a lot of decision making is on site, which is also about traditional architecture. In the old days, there were hardly any plans, just be a basic sketch about the overall dimensions. And all the decisions of where the window will come, doors would come, the way the roof pattern was done, was actually decided on site. The whole process now you have of sitting in an office and designing something which is just going a couple of times during the whole period of construction to the site is what's disconnected us and what it gives a very bland architectural solution that we see today. So here we hardly made any drawings. It must have been totally about 10 drawings completely. But they were all little small sketches that were developed on site. Say, okay, this is coming to this. Let's try this detail. Let's work with this sort of opening. So we of course reduced the amount of woodwork because we don't have forest certified wood that's available in Goa, or for that matter, most of India. So we just redated the stone. We put these steel frames. So again, it's a contemporization. Traditional architecture would have had maybe a wooden window and thing, but we use steel almost shamelessly and just put like a frosted glass in it, and it serves itself perfectly well because it also seals fairly well, and yet it still looks old world because the shape we've used, the grill detail we've used, all that is still being rooted in the past. There's only one concrete column in the whole building which actually runs up, and the roofing system is done in coconut wood, and coconut wood is actually the most sustainable wood that you can get, like bamboo. Of course, bamboo you can't use it as a rafter, but coconut wood you can because it's linear in its grains. And coconut wood, if you treat it with linseed oil, can last 100 years without a problem. It's a little wavy, but that's easy to handle. And so we use coconut wood. We use traditional country tiles on top of it. Extremely economical and very easy to build and maintain in it. And of course, the flooring is just IPS. Again, here's a chance to actually teach masons to work with traditional material, which in most places across India has been completely lost. And if done properly, it's brilliant floors, and it also the patterns you can use are anything that comes to mind. We're actually creating livelihoods for people who work, for people who otherwise would not have worked in this material. So there you can see some more IPS work. And here again, the dining room recycling materials. We got Kettler columns, and so rather than just put them as decorative elements, they are actually structural elements. They are bearing, each column is actually bearing about 2 tons of load. And when we actually made these, put them up, we had no idea how much these columns could bear, but cracks started appearing in the columns. And so we quickly read up on traditional architecture of Kerala and how do they actually work with it. And there's a realization that by just simply strapping the wood with metal rings, you can actually double the load-bearing capacity of wood. So we quickly put these metal straps on the wood, and now it's been like almost over 25 years now that these columns have been standing completely. In fact, the pool wall that you see of the giant pool, 3 meters tall, it touches the back of the room, so it helps cool the rooms. And there's no concrete in that wall at all. It's all masonry. It's a stepped masonry that slowly steps down, and protects, waterproofs the wall. That's the living room of the space. It's a giant dome about 11 meters in diameter, just brick and mud dome, and of course plastered underneath and above. This took us 4 days to build it, and it meant really calling traditional systems because again here we had worked with smaller domes before, but we just have a single arm that actually moves out, and as you move up, and the very simple methodologies and actually how do you keep the bricks from slipping down and falling. And once you get the hang of it, it's unbelievably easily how these structures, which don't need any concrete, can be built so quickly and come up. That's, of course, you can see a brick dome. This is much smaller. It's about 5.5 meters in diameter. Again, the brick and mud. Because it's far better to use mud because mud is stickier. Whereas cement, even though it may feel stronger in the longer run, the brick will just slide down the moment you start lifting it up beyond a certain angle. And of course, we work with teams. Like the previous slide was, of course, like you could see the star theme in that, in the flooring over there. So we took that star theme into like the windows and mirrors and everything. So it's, while you're dealing with tradition, you don't have to be very serious about stuff. You know, it always means you have to really innovate, to have fun, play around with all the elements that you're using. And here in this particular project, we actually looked at the cosmos themes, you know, like all the earth, air, fire, water, plant life, all that were themes that we actually put together. This example is the sun theme. So it starts influencing the way we detail. And you can see the back wall over there. That's the wall of the swimming pool, actually. You can see the stepping and the way the stepping being had. So rather than see direct retaining wall, we added these arches to it. It also helps in bracing the retaining wall. And the level steps on that bench where the lower spot is, as it moves up, is actually the stepping in the retaining wall. But you can't really imagine that would be the retaining wall of the pool because it's been handled in a certain aesthetic manner. And of course, the detailing is how do you contemporize traditional details. This is like a unique window in terms of it tapers down, and you realize, but actually playing around with these elements which are otherwise so standard, rectangular doors and windows, and this allows you to actually peep at a lower level. So it goes down almost to just just 2 feet above the ground as a pointed thing, and your whole sort of framing of the view really interesting.
Just a second.
Yeah, that's of course the moon room over there, which is, again, you can see the themes running into it. And the themes actually even can influence the architectural detailing. So you can see the step is curved and sunk. The little sort of niches that are put in also have the little moon crescent element to it. And of course, it also influences the furniture and the detailing. The sea room with the detailing. We use China mosaic a lot. It's extremely cheap. Again, it's about excitement of the craftsman. The craftsmen love, working on this material, because a normal tiler just has to put this really, bland tires. There's some pattern tile you get in these fancy shops. But here every room they do, every bathroom or surface they do, they're inventing themselves. They're actually putting their creative abilities into the project. And that's so important in traditional architecture, is to create that sense of pride of the craftsperson in what they're doing, which we don't see in today's architecture. Maximum you see, okay, fine, a Rajasthani guy will do a little bit of, carving work on the floor or the panel somewhere, but we don't leave enough space for artisans to actually intervene in our architecture. This is the earth and fire room. Again, you can see the detailing responding to it, and in the bathroom as well. It's a more recent room that we added, which is actually a Nubian vault. In Nubian, you must have seen the architecture of Hassan Fatih, which has this vaulted space. Nubian vault, of course, is where you do it ring by ring. There's no formwork, and you lean one ring against the other. So the last ring, of course, sits on a solid surface like the back of a hill or a solid wall, the Nubian vault leans back. So, of course, in the front of the building, since the vault actually leaned back, we added a little ferrous cement canopy to it. So ferrous cement versus a brick wall are two. Ferrous cement is fairly recent architectural element, but yet it sort of complemented the traditional brick vaulting system of a traditional architecture. So it's perfectly all right to actually add new elements or new materials in a traditional element, so long as you understand what each element is doing and what its characteristics are, how you're responding with its form. And that's, of course, on the right, you see the interior of the room itself. And that's the bathing area. So architecture is really about working with tradition as about the detail. Traditional architecture always has a great level of detail, whereas modern contemporary architecture lacks that level of detail that goes into it. Coming again, talking about an architecture, as I mentioned earlier, is an architecture is not just about the building itself, but the negative spaces. And this is a classic example of, in this project, where we designed the building by first carving out all the circulation spaces and the courtyards. So this is a project which has square courtyards, circular courtyards, crescent-shaped courtyards, star-shaped courtyards, all linked together through this open spine that runs through it. So each courtyard has 3 or 4 rooms of it. And so every room is completely unique. There are no 2 identical rooms in the space, and each has a completely different shape. So you can see the courtyards moving one to the other through these circular spine-like circulation spaces. And of course, the finishes here are much simpler, just plain IPS flooring, not even cast in situ. But you can see the brick domes, which actually brings down the cost and creates this great level of rooting to the architecture. And of course, here, coconut roofing. And everywhere there's some level of detail added. So you can see even in the partition walls, there's the archway that is there, which again gives that sense of detail and material usage on the inside. Because most often we work with the outside a lot. Most people, architectures we see today, but very few people actually bring the architecture into the space itself. And that's extremely essential, especially if you're trying to recall a traditional architecture, because traditional and vernacular architecture has that bit of architecture actually coming into the building and not this bland white wall, flat, uninteresting spaces. So there's another project where we looked at the themes of Goa. I mean, so while the climatic themes or the geographic themes of Goa are a great influence on the architecture. So if you have a coastal house, a certain thing, a house in the fields, a certain look, a house in the hills, a certain look. So we looked at these three themes, and we did a series of rooms, about 3 or 4 rooms of each theme. So like the sea theme rooms has, it doesn't really look like a beach house, but it responds in some way to the level of detailing and the material choice that we use in it. So sort of the colors, the motifs, everything of the sea rooms are generate a certain sort of aesthetic. The field rooms have a certain aesthetic where we detail out the windows, the railings, the field rooms in terms of the terracotta floor, the bamboo furniture, the hill rooms with a certain approach, and again, but having a lot of detail thrown into the architecture as well. So there's of course the entrance gate to it, which responds to the fact that it's a close to a coastal area, and the palm leaf was the starting point. This is a spa we did for the Taj in Goa. It's an Ayurvedic spa. So the first thing we thought of is how do we actually respond to Ayurveda, and we looked at the Kerala temples where Ayurveda really started. So we looked at how can we recreate that in a way. So we have, of course, the outer pavilion, the sitting area, the deep stump, the otla as the resting areas, the little sort of refreshment areas before you enter the main spa, and this hall of contemplation. The hall of contemplation basically it has all the light actually entering through a water body. So like the Kerala temples, you may have seen where there's some part of the temple actually dips into the water tank in the back of the temple. We created the same effect. So all this light bounces up the water, and you can actually sit there, meditate before or after a massage. And the rooms are done thematically, of course, earth, air, fire, water, which is drawing a bit of tradition into thing. And the back wall, which is the darker side of the room, is lit with traditional diya. So you're actually building a little sacredness into the space by using the old stone elements of diyas in it, and actually creating a ritual. So our buildings need to allow to actually root itself, or ritual tradition is actually allow for these rituals to actually take place in the building. Of course, it's a couple's massage room, but again, we responded in some way, the way motifs or the sort of the ceiling we handle, and all this is integrating actually an air conditioning system, a lighting system. And the outside of the building is mounted like the Kerala temples with this wooden grid. And every evening, the whole building is actually lit. So it starts making the spa almost a sacred space in a way, which is so essential to recall the past. This is a hotel which we've done in a Siazad area, which has, there was an existing building over there, and we had to add 4 cabins to it. So we had 2 temporary structures, since we're not allowed to build something permanent beyond what was existing. So we had these, what you see on the right is the wooden cabins that we had. And we thought, wooden cabins, there's not much history of really this sort of wooden cabin. While Kerala has some other parts of India have these wooden cabins, it's far more ornate. And we wanted something that's fairly simple to go with simplicity of the old concrete house. So we said, let's look abroad for this. And we found the Japs were really great. It's very lightweight architecture. So we looked at the Japanese style of architecture, where we just create these little wooden boxes which sat off the ground completely, little light shelves you can see through that window, which allowed light at different levels. The restaurant we did in a very Japanese style. So you're actually borrowing an architecture from far, far away, and yet it actually suited the place because of the sort of calmness, the simplicity we wanted in this particular hotel project. So you can see all the sitting areas, the bed areas actually lift off the ground, so you can actually see everything down. the furniture and everything was done in that particular theme. So we took the themes of climatic themes of winter, autumn, summer, fall. So you can see this is the winter room. And we even got a poet to write haikus. You can see behind that lamp, that's actually a poem on the winter season. So when you're looking at tradition, it means not just involving the craft people, it's involving the creative things. How can we get artists on board to actually contribute to such a thing? How do you get, say, furniture makers, fabric makers, to actually integrate into the architecture itself? Because that really brings about a tradition and the vernacular. So that's, of course, some of the rooms, the other rooms with the other climatic themes as well. The two, of course, existing rooms in the house, we converted into a sun room and a moon room. So from about 15 years ago, we started first working with the Taj in the jungle in Madhya Pradesh. Now we do a number of projects across India and different regions, it's mainly in tiger sanctuaries actually. So this is for the Coffee Day group in Sarai. So this is just the entrance building, and so here we looked at what's available in terms of materials, and we saw a great history of stonework and patchwork, and all this was available in a nearby village. So we actually designed buildings which use a lot of this stonework and got the local people to actually build the structure after designing, and even the plaster work was something traditional. So we kept the softness of the very rough and hand finished plaster thing over there. So that's the restaurant area. And all this is, again, as I said, it's built by local people, just the guidance and training, say, to get stonework in a particular form, aesthetic. And that's the inside of some of the cottages. All the waste wood you can see is actually used as formwork for the ceiling. So you can see that indentation taking place. Yet the inside is comfortable. There's a contemporary, strong contemporary inside to it, and yet a very traditional outside. That's one of the wooden cabins over there. Working in South, of course, there's a great colonial influence, especially in the tea estates. So again, we responded to traditional materials that are available there, and craftsmanship and work abilities that are available in Spawn architecture, which can be easily built without much intervention into the space. Using a fair amount of woodwork, because a lot of these coffee estates, they keep on harvesting trees and regrowing it. So using woodwork here was not too much of an issue for us at the moment. This is a project in Bhopal, just outside the city, and just next to the Bandihar Sanctuary. It was an old orchard area, and we felt that we need to respond in a very rural approach. So we created along this long site a central building which had all the restaurants and the conference halls and reception areas, and along that was this. So that's the reception area which we entered into. That's the pavilion which looks onto the field. So one side we kept for all the services, and the other side we kept as open fields. So that's the lounge area, and this long corridor which keeps on zigzagging through the property, which leads to courtyards. So those are the room configurations with sit out overlooking the orchard area. And these little courtyards, either 3 or 5 rooms, it looks like a little village square, which you enter into, keeping seating areas outside. Because again, the village is all about the interactions. We wanted that people exiting their room instead of going straight into a corridor actually have a pause space, because tradition is really about how people behave, in these public spaces, in their own space, and responding to them with architectural solutions. So in each room, of course, you had, like in farmlands, the little perch where they could see what's happening in their field. So this is like a little pavilion outside the room they can see and look at the fields beyond them. That's the inside of the room and the pool area. So working with the Taj, of course, in Bench is how do you respond to, so there was an existing room which you gutted, of course, and created something that's comfortable and air conditioned. But we also created this room which they could spend the night in, which is basically this machan using forest wood. I mean, all the fallen trees from the forest department, we bought them, and we can actually create these pavilions where we had a sleeping area above and a bathing area below that. This for the Taj again in Bandhavgarh, which is the opening slide that you've seen over here. And this again it's a mud wall building, but it's it's a sophisticated mud wall. So rather than use a solid thick wall, it's actually a double wall with insulation in between, such that we have great thermal insulation. And all this was actually built by the local men of the village. And all the decoration done by the women. You can see the decoration on the windows, the seats and everything were done there. And we got artifacts from the village, so artifacts and whatever else we could get were actually purchased in the village. And that's the inside of the thing. You can see it's very simple, and yet it's very sophisticated, and despite its being so rustic, it's quite pricey. And you realize that when you talk about tradition, people are looking forward to actually recalling what the past is like, and sort of experiencing what it is to live in something which is traditional and richer culturally, one could say. That's all built up furniture in the space. Another lodge, again, we're responding to whatever local materials, but this is on the riverside. So really we use the river pebbles actually at the base of the building. Again, mud walls, local tiles, local bamboo and sort of reed for the roofing system. And of course, the bullies from the forest itself. But responding like this is the main, what they call the golgar in the property, but it's not round or it's not square. It's actually 5-pointed star-like thing. So you've got 2 dining areas, you've got a bar area, an entrance pavilion, a library, and that central fireplace that you see is meant to heat the place in winter, and also acts like a hot air escape in summer. So you're responding in a traditional thing. So the form doesn't have to be identical, square or round, whatever, based on the area. You can take any shape so long as you use the materials judiciously. Another jungle lodge where we actually, again, responded to the local materials that were available. There were existing tree houses, of course, which were almost falling apart when we took over the property. We refurbished them and made them a little more sophisticated. Added, again, local stone from the area. We added these riverfront cottages. The walling system is actually like a prefab walling system. It's just like little wooden battens and steels. And the roofing system is actually insulated metal steel. So we're perfectly all right in actually using new technologies, new materials, especially if it's really appropriate, because that insulated metal thing works far better than any other roofing system. You have monkeys in the area which otherwise break tiles. So we find it perfectly all right to actually even use this, what would otherwise be an industrial material. When we move on to our institutional projects, we found we needed to really root the architecture. So it looks like it's been there for hundreds of years. And one way to really root it is build it around a courtyard, which has been our traditional open space in an architecture, especially in institutional architecture. So this is a building which is meant for the studying of Konkani as a language. And there's many buildings. So it has the library block, the classroom block, the administrative block, the residence. So most buildings tend to actually respond in a particular way. Identity windows, they're all parts of the house, but all parts of the projects. But here we decided that every sort of building, like the library building, has to respond to what it needs. So like the windows come in between the stacks perfectly. So these are long, slim windows. The classroom will have a broader, lower window, or the administrative block has something else. Residential block has different opening, but they're all held together by this common courtyard. Again, another institutional building, again held together by a central courtyard, celebrating the entrance. Traditional architecture always celebrates the entrance of the building. It allows you a glimpse of what is inside, whether it's a courtyard or another open space over there. And it's very clear in its circulation and the way it actually sits in, allowing you to clearly understand what the pattern is. And so that's, of course, one of the 2 wings in the building. That staircase that you see is actually becomes an amphitheater in the evening. And it's about rooting it. So adding these little elements like the staircase you see is to give it that sense of being in the past. This is a building which is very contemporary. It's a cathedral in Karwar. Again, we're looking at elements which are taken from the past, but assembled in a very contemporary manner. So this building actually has a tiered seating, and it's got air tanks below that seating, which act as a cooling system. And while we use like a traditional roofing system of tiles, it's not exactly a traditional pattern of form of roof. It's actually almost tree-like. So you have this roofing system which goes beyond the walls. So the walls actually are not supportive. The roof does not sit on the walls like in a traditional architecture, but actually sits in these columns and spans out like a tree, supporting a roof that actually covers the whole building. And from the wall, the peripheral walls, they're just like a glass or mesh that lets in the light from the side. This is a monastery which, for the Spanish nuns, where they wanted the building to last 400 years because they didn't want it's a cloistered monastery, so nobody's supposed to enter once they start living over there. So we designed a building which is completely all masonry, which is very traditional in its approach. But we left space for services, so you can see the little ducts over there. The services to be upgraded, because services always needs, whether it's plumbing, electricals, or communication lines, needed to be upgraded. So that could be added in very easily. And that's the final product. Of course, the roofing system, we thought giving a brick wall system may be a little alien for Goa. So we added a traditional roofing system to it, which you can see over there. This is the university in Hampi, Kanda University, where again we work in stonework. Hampi, as you know, has got such great traditional architecture. So we actually looked at how we could use the stonework, and so 90% of the building is actually all stone. And the gopurams that you see there are actually wind towers. There's a water tank on top, these stone fins that come down. So we hydrated the air at a high level, cool it down by almost 8 degrees. And there are 3 gopurams that come, and the hot air enters, the cold air enters the building and escapes as hot air past the central temple tank that we see there. That's the structural system. You can see of the columns, the flint roofing system that's been used. And that's the stone column, which are about 6 meters tall, about 50 by 50 centimeters. Initially, the contractor said that we can't build it, but I said they've done it 300 years ago. This was done. So quickly they got their act together and were able to build this. So using the same principle of, since we talked about form follows climate, here in this approach for this proposed school in Bijapur, which projects on hold, we looked at the same thing. Can we create these mini gopurams, which are actually these wind towers? And that's a structural system of the building. So you not only have a functional thing of cooling the building, but you also have a structural system that supports the roof and walling systems. So you've taken hot air, you hydrate it, and you let it into the building, and you create this roofing system. So here, again, shamelessly using new technologies, materials in a very contemporary manner, but being rooted. Bijapur has, great bricks, so you can use that very easily, stone as well. So when we talk about tradition and materials and technologies, this is a project we did for Maharashtra Tourism Development Corporation. They wanted a 40-room hotel in this place just north of Goa, a place called Haddi. Great backwaters, little islands, and we went there. And luckily, there was a great IS office over there. And I said, I wish we couldn't build. And he says, okay, let's look at it. And so we came up with the idea of actually, since there are fisher folk over there, can we give tourism to the people? So we designed these little floating platforms, like the Kerala rice boats, where people could stay on, and they could come together in the evening and act as a single hotel, or they'd separate and go into the backwaters and have individual rooms sitting in different places in the water. And you have we measured every house in the village itself. We proposed that each house could become a homestay. And so rather than becoming bellboys and waiters in a hotel, they could become actually the owners of that mini hotel, which had 1 or 2 rooms. And the government would actually just put together the organization of creating a cooperative, for example, or getting the people together in helping them microfinance the project through. So you're providing tourism, but at the same time, you're creating a great experience for the people because the tourists would now live in somebody's house. They get genuine food. They get to see their culture at much greater depth, and the local people would actually benefit because their earning will be much higher rather than having a paid job. They're now becoming the hosts, for the tourism and the genuine experience of the tourists. It's almost a win-win situation, and the money which would otherwise have gone to build a hotel would go to doing up their jetties, doing up their beach facilities, their marketplaces, their places of worship. So even the experience of the tourist is cleaned up, and there's a more sanitized and culturally rich sort of backdrop that they have. So we work a lot across the country. This is for the country club people. How do we actually bring tradition into like a modern, say, housing? This is actually a housing project that was there. So we looked at in a rural area. So we thought so we created these modules. So you just buy a module. So it can be just 1-bedroom module, but all these modules stick together. So you can actually make 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom. And it's a configuration where you can actually add. So all those 4 units can actually become even one house, or they could separate into as many configurations as you want to. So working with traditional architecture, drawing these elements is an essential part of this for another hotel project. How do you draw tradition, create a modernity to it, so it stays responsible to the architecture around. This is for the government again, a circuit house, working with the outside street and working with the building, which felt like was in a public space. It's not always been there. And these are a number of projects we working with the street, the form of the building, but keeping tradition, materials, detailing in mind, and the streetscape and elevation as part of it. In rural areas, as you've seen also before, is how do you actually take these elements, but contemporize into a form that has never been there. But just by the simple use of materials or the new shape that you're creating, you feel that it's could possibly be a traditional building in some way. So these, of course, lodges where you do across the country. But when you do a lodge, it's not just about materials, it's also about how do you address it climatically. So this particular lodge has not natural ventilation system. It comes underfloor, moves out. And so every project like this particular lodge, we analyze the project and we say, how do we heat a lodge in winter passively? How do we cool a lodge in summer passively? Understanding it is extremely essential. How do we create new shapes to lodges, new configurations? So if you take traditional elements and you just keep on playing around in different ways, in gear, creating this thing of courtyards, using mud as buildings in a lion sanctuary, and making it almost handmade and old world in a way. And these various lodges that we've had, and I realize I'm running out of time, so just flash these last one. We worked a little in Ladakh, and Ladakh has, for structural system, these willow trees, and they vary in length from 3 meters to 5 meters. We thought, instead of say using a standard grid, maybe of 4 meters, what if we use all the logs, right, from 3 meters to 5 meters? So we created this trapezoidal system. So one end is 3 meters, the other end is 5 meters. So, but just switching the grid, zigzagging the grid a little, you can actually create a straight long building. Or if you allow it in the same direction, you can actually have a building which turns around. So using every single log, and yet you've actually now added a new twist to the architecture as well. So across the countries, we're working on different projects, creating communities. So it's not just about the building, as I said, it's creating what are the public spaces like, and how do we create that? So the government over here also, for their market complex, we looked at how they wanted us to design a market complex, and their envisioning was, of course, this concrete building or glass-clad building. But we said we have to look back at the past. What were our marketplaces? What made them so nice and special? And that was the pavilion-like feel. So we designed the marketplace, which is very old world. A lot of the politicians were very disappointed. They said, it doesn't have any flash to it. It's very ordinary looking. And we said, that's exactly what we want. We want something that people can identify with, have transparency, move through it comfortably, and feel like it's always been there. This is an interesting project where we looked at, when you look at traditional architecture, we always look at something as permanent and something as temporary. So either it's temporary and goes, or it's permanent and it's very difficult to work with. So this is a house we actually designed, which is never got built though, which is actually 4 giant columns. And each of the columns, of course, either a staircase, a toilet, a kitchen. And there's an inner floor, which is actually prefab. So you can actually have steel and say a cement board, a wooden floor, and these lightweight partition walls, which were there. And there was just a giant vault, a stone vault that would cover the whole roof of it. And the idea was, you could, once you build the stonework, you could inhabit it. You could keep on changing the configuration of rooms. So the lower level would be mainly the living rooms, the upper level mainly the bedrooms, accessible through those towers. So everything else was lightweight. So when the house was finished and its staying was over, you could actually just take out all these partitioning lightweight systems which are made out of lightweight materials and leave it like it was always there. Thank you very much. So it's time for questions. Please feel free to ask them.
Thank you, Dean. It has been, a very beautiful session where we saw a lot of your buildings. Where, I have all throughout the session. I've heard you earlier also, and I've seen some of your works in Goa, stayed at Captain Lobos, and seen some of your buildings. But I have been wondering how with less drawings would you be actually creating this system of managing things on site, because that requires a lot of supervision, while this the scale or the detail or the building. I know sketches work very well on site, but still, from you I would like to hear what system is adopted, and how could you actually groom yourself from being an architect of making lines on a piece of paper, as we teach to our students also, to being the genius that you are today.
Yeah, so I think it comes with experience of working with buildings over all these years, so more recently, of course, we've ensured that there's a good project management on board. In the old days, we had very few projects, so we can actually afford time to visit site and make those little decisions on site, which is so important for very responsive architecture. But today, of course, we rely now on project management, on of course catching the glitches before they happen. But also, as I mentioned earlier, it's also about empowering the craftspeople on site to allow them to make those decisions on site, rather than everything coming as a finished drawing. I recently went to a house that I'd done in South Goa 35 years ago, and I asked them, for the working drawing. They wanted to renovate something and extend something else. And they opened the file, and inside the file were postcards. So it would take me 2 hours to get to the place. So I used to send postcards, make out little sketches, and post it. So there was just a whole lot of postcards that I'd referred, and they're all little sketches. Of course, there was one big base plan.
Right.
So all the detailing was done. So the contractor would just receive this postcard. Okay, I handle this arch in this way, or this corbel in this way, and so we've lost that ability to connect with our sites, and that's so essential to creating an architecture that is detailed and interesting.
Right. In fact, I have been jotting down all the points that you had mentioned in the process of defining the contemporary architecture with a lot of vernacular influences that you have used. I'll send it to you. It requires a little bit of vetting, but it's a very exhaustive list. There are lots of questions which are there in the chat box. Some people are actually inquisitive about wanting to know how that old recycled material in building structures is actually how much of a challenge it is. Say, for example, somebody is recycling old windows or doors. So what is the process? Are the materials procured before? I think the question aims at saying that, is the material procured beforehand when the civil work is starting, or is it found after the civil work is finished, or something like that? Then there are a lot of questions on the ability to identify craftsmen who could actually take that freedom to investigate beyond your sketches and do things. And Meera is one person who is wanting to ask, what were the initial hiccups? And as you mentioned, it was actually a gradual process, So these are certain questions which people would like you to answer.
Yeah, so if remember the example I showed you in Nilaya of those Kettler columns, which are bearing the load of the stonework above of 2 tons, whatever. So we'd asked for 4 columns, for this roofing system. We suddenly realized there were 2 tall columns and 2 short columns, So we're wondering, what do we do? So so we just responded by actually creating a roof, an arch that slowly moved down. So it spanned, it moved down to 1 column from the wall. Then it's moved down further to the shorter column. So suddenly it actually created an interesting, rather than have a roofing system which was straight, even the roof started dipping down because the columns are shorter. Most often, of course, we get buy the materials before the building starts, but sometimes we get something new, but while the construction process is going on, we sort of adjust it to integrate with it. And using these old materials really gives a sense of it always being there, because it's very difficult now to make those columns or those windows or doors or old floorings, whatever. But it suddenly gives that presence that this building is traditional. It is from the past, and that's very important to sort of root that in some way.
Yeah.
In terms of the craftspersons, sometimes you find some really brilliant people. I mean, they may be working as a metalsmith somewhere, and you challenge them, if since you're a metalsmith, can you do something, making out of the same? And for them, they're waiting for a creative opportunity to actually try something new. So if you give them the freedom to actually try something, you test them out and see if they can actually do it, you'd be amazed at how many people can be trained and brought into being a craftsperson. So as I said, those masons that came in over there, a lot of them were just basically farmers, but they were really enthusiastic, people. And the moment they understood, how things work and how do you put things together, say building an arch or vault or dome, it's actually very simple, and they really get excited. In fact, they never want to use a lintel again if they're doing, say, an opening, because they find it so much simpler than, than building a lintel, in fact,
Correct. So, in fact, I was thinking while you were making your presentations of an architecture which is born out of less drawings, that an architecture born out of less drawings, if required to be documented, would need a lot of drawings and specifications, which would be very difficult to write. If any of your buildings is to be documented, we need a phenomenal amount of drawings, which would be very difficult to make, and geometry, which is, which has to be discovered on site. There is a question wherein Reshma Praveen is asking that how much time do you spend, since you have made a lot of projects across the country, how much time do you spend in exploring local materials and its properties? So maybe are you totally dependent on the crafts, or would you actually investigate it yourself? Is I think where she's aiming at.
Yeah, as much. I mean, it's not too much of depth in that sense that we have time for, but we look what's been built traditionally. Are there people who can still do it? Or if they're not over there, even if there are a few people left, can those people actually help in training? Like, for example, the Coffee Day Hotel, when I started the plaster work over there, and all these guys were masons, were probably being trained under some contractor, and they're doing this absolutely smooth plaster. And I said that, I don't want the smooth plaster. So I said, okay, quick, get me your worst mason and let him come here. So curiously, guy who knew nothing about plaster. And I said, now the go, and you slap it on and you just put his hand, you rub it. And I said, that's exactly what I want, So they've lost that ability. They want everything otherwise sharp and sophisticated and straight, They've lost the ability of actually having something that's handmade, having a handmade quality to it. So
Correct.
And of course materials like the Ladakh example, where they wanted to use these bullies, and I would have otherwise, if I hadn't sort of said that, seeing that you're buying half the bullies and the other half would just be wasted, and you cut all these pieces, that it challenged me in how do I use every bully over there. And that's how I came up with the grid system of 3 to 5 meters.
Right.
And it really works beautifully because it now also offers a great interest to the room. In a sense, one wall is narrow, the other wall is tall, and you can keep on flipping this thing. You can twist the building the way you want to. So it actually creates a new approach to the architecture as well. So I wish we could, so I've used, stone flooring sitting on steel in the Reni Pani project, on steel U sections. So the stone actually runs into like a terrace. Stone is slightly cambered, so it runs into the steel channel. So here again, you're using a technology material and a traditional material. You're not just resting it and trying to seal a joint. You're actually creating a drainage system, using that steel section. So again, here's this metal which you would normally not use in the jungle, but I don't mind because it's most practical in that situation, and you minimize the amount of its use. And
right.
So I think that's what we need to get over is this hang up of is technology really valid? So in a traditional architecture. So I think it is, because you can draw from it practically, and so long as you minimize the use of it, so long as you use it in a justifiable manner, it's perfectly all right.
Yeah, thank you. There are two very pertinent questions. One is Pavanika Patil, who has asked a question for teachers as to how the technology and software-oriented studies in architecture can actually be, given a small amount of diversification, so that students can start rooting themselves and their sketches to do more creative stuff. That is one question. And then another question from Anika, where she says that, like in your Kerala project, where you involved a lot of public participation in the villages, wherein every house was measured, and every person would actually develop a community kind of a hotel facility, a homestay facility. So how this public involvement happens? These are two very good questions for you, sir.
Yeah, so I mean, with computers, we're actually losing the touch in architecture, and that, you know, I actually I'm quite a dinosaur when it comes to computers. I can just about open it and start it, and because I was introduced at a time when the most sophisticated. I joined college when the slide rule was the way we calculated things. So it wasn't even a calculator. Of course, we didn't have computers. So and I got so used to it. And also the earlier software is so clunky that I just took an aversion to, even though I love technology, it took an aversion to the way software is. But now things like SketchUp are actually showing great potential that in actually developing a design, showcasing it, exploring it. And so 3D modeling is most essential. The plan section, elevation, drawn separately is really out of the, but I think it's very essential that hand drawing is part, because there is definitely a hand-brain connection, which all architects and designers need to establish. So a lot of colleges have this thing of first and second year, no drafted drawings, no computer drawings, all hand drawing. And that's extremely important. But more than just the drafting, I think it's the sketching, which is ability. So it's how do you look at things, think in 3D, walk through the buildings that you draw. That's essential. It's actually designing your brain. Drawing it out is another thing, but how do you design it, envision it completely before you actually put pen to paper? That's extremely important to envision it. How, the form, the shape, the scale, the light, every materials that you use is developed inside your head before you actually, start drawing it. And and in terms of the other question was really on
public participation.
Yeah, so public participation is it's extremely important. In fact, so luckily, as I said, there was this IS officer over there who felt that building a hotel would really not be appropriate for the place. So about consensus building, and having worked on the regional plan, for Goa, where we actually had a consensus plan where we took the plan to every village and asked them, what do you want? What's your future? What's your aspiration for the village? And we realized that that's having the stakeholder sort of inputs is extremely important. So the moment, in fact, when we went to Hadi, and they were these guys were appalled that there was going to be a 40-room hotel in the thing. So we also were, we didn't realize, we thought, okay, fine, give them employment, but that's not what they want, because they realize that, it's going to really destroy their place. They probably sap their water or power from the village, which, but here, so how do we actually have a win-win situation where they benefit and tourism is also brought to the place? So I think it's first listening to the people, to this land, to the situation is extremely important. We worked on a school in Gurgaon where it was next to an empty piece of land where there's slum close by, and slum kids used to play in this school, in this ground where there was going to be a school built. So we designed a school which was on 3 levels. So there's a basement, and then there was a middle level, which was like 4.5 meters tall, where it was like a platform area where kids would have their recreational space, and it's linked onto the garden. And there was an upper floor with the 1st to 4th standard, which was elevated off the ground. So both the basement and that upper floor could be locked in the evening, and you could just open the gates and let the slum kids play in that same piece of land, which otherwise the school kids would have played in. Because, I mean, the school kids probably use it 5% of the actual time, in a year, if you take, holidays, and they're only for 8 to 2, whatever. Correct. So you're actually taking away from the people, and, so it's a social solution that you're actually looking at. And as architects, we now are at least getting conscious about environmental solutions. But I think social responsibility needs also to be integrated into our buildings as well.
Right. In fact, we are going on receiving lots of questions in the chat box, but only 2 more pertinent questions, Dean, and then we end this session. It's been a very long time that you have been talking. Asta Kalia wants to ask why being vernacular these days has become luxurious. And parallel to the question is a question by Sapna Shiv Kumar, who is saying that typically the bureaucracy is supposed to think very stereotypically. How easy or difficult was it to convince the decision making with the bureaucrats for approvals of the kind of solutions that you offer in design?
So, I mean, I'll take the second question first. So the bureaucrats, I mean, you get different types of bureaucrats. So there's some really interesting bureaucrats. In fact, you know, the reason why Charles did, you know, the buildings he did in Bhopal, you know, the Assembly Complex and Bharat Bhavan and I think a couple of others over there was, there was a Ashok Bajpai who was really a very progressive bureaucrat who realized that he needed to get these buildings to create this iconic image for Bhopal.
Correct.
And not just have the simple tender and everything. We actually chose, this is the guy I want. Okay, now we figure out how do we, you know, pay him or employ him and things.
Correct.
And those days are gone today. I mean, here now it's the lowest bidder, it's the cheapest thing, and it's really sad. So there are some really interesting bureaucrats, but they've been really decimated by the political systems. So I think we've empowered them. A lot of them are trained to really think innovatively and out of the box. We just need to give them the freedom, like this IS officer for the Hadi project, you know, was willing to say, I will convince my minister. And the project almost, you know, started, we had done everything for it, and you know, also initial tendering. And then, of course, he got transferred. And so the whole project, because there's nobody else to drive it after that.
Right. In fact, I must add to your information on Ashok Bajpai. He runs a foundation called Raza Foundation now. He is a poet himself, you know.
Yeah. Met him a couple of times there. Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, his son is doing some really interesting work. No?
I know his son is also an architect from Bhopal.
Yeah.
You know. There was this whole last question which Astha had asked: why being vernacular these days has become luxurious? Why is it not affordable by the common man, or maybe the sense of common man is what I would like to put it.
Yeah. So, I mean, my work in these young lodges with these natural materials is to create work. So, like I said, the only way to sell, say, something in this area is to make